And now it is my pleasure to welcome and introduce Hy. Dr. Hyman Penn is a recently retired pediatrician with Texas Children's Pediatrics. He serves as a trustee of the Jewish Federation of Greater Houston and is the immediate past president of his synagogue, Temple Beth Torah in Humble. Hy is also a longtime docent at Holocaust Museum Houston and is a member of the museum's board of trustees. He co-hosts the Schmooze with Zoom, a bi-weekly virtual program for Houston survivors and their descendants. Hy is the son of Holocaust survivors Linda and Morris Penn, and tonight he will share his unique story of growing up with 3 Holocaust survivors in his family, which includes his maternal grandmother, Riva Kremer. Over to you, Hy.
Thank you so much, Tamara. And thank you everybody for joining tonight. And I want to especially thank Holocaust Museum Houston for giving me this opportunity to present. This is my first public presentation of this, and I'm very excited to do it and hope to take it on the road to many schools and other organizations. But thank you all for joining us. The photo documentation will not appear on the slides, but I do have a spreadsheet if anybody is interested where the origin of that photo came from. Most of them are from the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. And on that note, we will begin. The Holocaust was a terrible event in the history of the world, with millions of people murdered. Millions others had their lives changed forever. And as Tamara said, today we're going to focus on 3 individuals. Because by focusing on individuals, we will see that the Holocaust is not just about numbers, but about actual people. My brother Robert, sister Cynthia Weinberger, and I may be the only local family to grow up with 3 survivors in the home. And this is their story. One and one and one. Before I introduce you to my parents and grandmother, I would like to give you just a brief introduction to the Holocaust. This may be familiar to many of you, but for some it may not. The Holocaust was the systematic, state-organized persecution and murder of nearly 6 million Jews by Nazi Germany and its collaborators. Jews have lived in Europe for more than 2,000 years. In 1933, approximately 9.5 million Jews lived in Europe, comprising 1.7% of the total European population. This number represented more than 60% of the world's Jewish population at that time, estimated at 15.3 million. Here's a map just to give you an idea of the numbers of Jews that were living in the different countries in Europe in 1933. And you can see Germany in the center had over 500,000 Jews living there, where Poland had over 3 million and the Soviet Union over 2.5 million Jews. 2/3 of Europe's Jews and 1/3 of the world's Jewish population were murdered in the Holocaust. And approximately 1.5 million children were murdered in the Holocaust. The overwhelming majority were Jewish. Of the European Jewish children alive in 1939, only 11% survived. The Jews were the largest group targeted, but approximately 5 million others were also murdered. Those include the Roma Sinti people, sometimes referred to as the Gypsies, communists, socialists, people with disabilities, homosexuals, Jehovah's Witnesses. Hitler and the Nazi Party came into power when Hitler became Chancellor of Germany in 1933. A police state was created, democracy was dead in Germany, and civil rights disappeared. The goal of the Nazis was to have a Jew-free society. Hundreds of laws were passed against the Jews to exclude them from German society, hoping the 500,000 German Jews would emigrate from Germany on their own. But most of the world was not interested in helping the Jews. Back to the maps, a map of Europe with Poland highlighted, and right above Poland, you see the country of Lithuania. These are the two countries we're going to focus on today. And just a blow up of that, you see Poland. We're going to be talking about this city, Grodno, right on the Niemen River there. And not too far away in Lithuania, we're going to be talking about, right about there, a town called Vilkaviskis. So just so you'll have an idea where these cities are. Everything crashed when September 1st, 1939 came. World War II began with the Nazi invasion of Poland. As we said, Poland had a population of over 3 million Jews, the largest of any European country. So what are the Nazis to do with all these Jews? They first created ghettos, a place to round up and have the Jews segregated. And that didn't work. They went to mobile killing squads, also called the Einsatzgruppen, Holocaust by bullets. That didn't work. And then they came up with a final solution where gas chambers were built, as well as crematoriums where the bodies were burned. So we start in Grodno, Poland. Grodno, Poland was a city really, of about 50,000 people. 40% of the population was Jewish. Jews were merchants, artisans, small manufacturers. There were many Jewish schools. There were synagogues in Grodno, many synagogues, many Jewish newspapers. It had a rich cultural Jewish life, including Jewish theaters and libraries. It dates back to the 14th century, the Jewish community there. And I want to introduce to you a family that lived there. This is my mother's family. And in the family, you see Chaim, my grandfather, who I'm named after, and his wife, Riva, my grandmother, my mother, Luba, and my mother's little brother, Joseph. Chaim, they were a middle-class family, I assume. Chaim had a dry cleaning business and in Grodno. My grandmother was from Bialystok, and she came to Grodno when she married her husband. She took care of the kids and was a homemaker in Grodno. After the war broke out, things got worse. They had to eventually go into a ghetto in 1941, toward the end of 1941. There were actually two different ghettos in Grodno, and they were given 6 hours to move. The conditions in the ghettos were very poor. They kept a photograph of my mother's brother dressed up for Purim, but they didn't have anything else. They really had miserable conditions. You can see how crowded it is in the Grodno ghetto from this photograph. You can see too in this photograph in Grodno, they had to wear the yellow star whenever they were in public. On one day, in February 13th, 1943, they were told they were being relocated. They were going to be moving out of the ghetto. And they were told to pack a bag, like many of the people that were put on transports. And they had to report and gather in the synagogue where they stayed overnight. And the next day, they took about 2,500 of the Jews of Grodno, and they marched them to the railroad station nearby. They didn't know where they were going at this time. But I wanted to show you before we get started, this was February of 1943, but these are the different camps that my mother and grandmother survived. They were in 9 different camps, which is unusual for a survivor. And the first camp that they went to was Treblinka. They got on the train, and these weren't regular passenger trains. They were boxcars used for cattle. And they arrived in Treblinka. And when they opened the doors to the cattle cars, I remember my mother telling me there was so much commotion, so much screaming. The guards were screaming at them, and they told them, you go here, you go there, you go here, you go there. And they told my mother and grandmother to go in one direction, and they told her father and little brother to go in another direction. And that was the last time my mother saw her father and little brother. They went straight to the gas chambers. My mother and grandmother were also in a line to the gas chambers, because if you know anything about Treblinka, it was one of the 6 killing centers, and very, very few people survived this camp, because it was not a work camp as some of the camps were. This was purely an extermination camp. But they were in line to the gas chamber, and a friend of my mother's, somebody she knew in Grodno, someone her age, her family was, I guess, in the other line, and my grandmother kind of took her under the wing. And this was Vivian, who would become a lifelong friend of my grandmother and mother. And while they were in line, one of the Nazi soldiers came up to them and said, come with us. They needed 100 women and 3 physicians to go on a work detail. And they took my mother, grandmother, and Vivian with them. And they took them to Majdanek. This is a photograph of Majdanek. You can see the barracks where the people lived. You can see the double barbed wire fencing, which was electrified, and you can see the guard tower off in the distance. They were here actually only for one day. This is the crematoria at Majdanek. And they were taken from Majdanek to a work camp. And that was called Flugplatz. It was part of the Majdanek system. All these major camps had multiple subcamps. And Flugplatz was a subcamp. They were all in the Lublin district of Poland. And they went to Flugplatz. Flugplatz was built, I think it opened in 1942, if I'm not mistaken. It was built on the Lublin airfield. It was the airport for Lublin, Poland. And they built this camp that was primarily to sort all the clothing that they got from other camps, mainly the camps of Sobibor and Treblinka, and I think Belzec is where the clothing was coming from. And my mother and grandmother were here, and Vivian were here for about 7 months. And your job was to sort through all the clothing. I remember my mother telling me nothing was wasted, and they had to search for secret pockets that were sewn into garments and look for jewelry and other things, items that could be used. But my mother said everything went back to Germany. Nothing was left. Everything was to be used. One day while they were at Flugplatz, the conditions were very bad, as they were in most of these camps. A guard came into their barrack and said, we need 45 women to volunteer to work in a marmalade factory to make jellies and jams. And my mother raised her hand. My mother was born in 1927, so she was a teenager at this time. And her mother, my grandmother, says, put your hand down. It's a trick. And my mother says, I can't stand it anymore. I have to get out of here. And they start arguing, just like you may have argued with a parent or with your own children. And my mother just said, I just can't take it, and ran toward the guard. Well, my mother and my mother's mother was not going to leave her alone and went with her. And Vivian, my mother, were taken away. And you know where they were taken? They were taken to a marmalade factory in Milieu, a village in Poland. This factory, Jewish prisoners produced food for the SS and the Wehrmacht, the German military, just in the local jam factory. And they worked here for about 3 weeks during late October, early November of 1943. And from there, they were taken to Treblinka. And this is a view of Treblinka showing a portion of the barracks and a watchtower. When they got to Treblinka And it was famous for a lot of SS guards were trained in this camp. So if you've heard the name, this is where many of them were trained. But they got there. It housed 6,000 Jewish prisoners, but the camp was deserted. There was nobody there except for these 45 women and a group of men that were brought in. And they soon found out that while they were at that marmalade factory, everybody who was in Treblinka, everybody who was in Majdanek, everybody who was at Flugplatz, the camp that they were sorting all the belongings at, everyone at those camps were murdered. It was an event that became known as the Harvest Festival. It was the largest massacre that was perpetrated by the Nazis during the Holocaust, where 42,000 Jews were murdered in a 2-day period. They took the prisoners to Majdanek, played loud music because they used their weapons to murder the Jews by bullets. This was ordered by the SS chief Heinrich Himmler. And it was ordered because of uprisings at Treblinka, Sobibor, and many of the ghettos. And this was just to pay back and let the Jews know what they're in for if they try anything again. So they had a lot of freedom at this camp. The men that were brought into this camp, their job was to burn the bodies, and they used railroad tracks. They kind of made barbecue pits out of them and put the bodies across and burn the bodies. That were their job. And the women's job was to clean all the barracks because there were thousands of people that had lived there and there was a lot of work to do. So they were here for about 7 months. This is an interesting photograph that Vivian, my mother's friend, had sent me. And this is a picture of some of them. This is my mother here at the lower right, and this is her in this picture on the right. That's her on the right side and Vivian on the left. And Vivian thinks it was taken by the guard. The guard became very friendly with them because there was one guard, and he was the only guard there in the whole camp watching these women. You can see they were able to wear their regular clothing. But I thought it's just an interesting picture to see people in a concentration camp just living their life. They had plenty of food because there was a lot of food left over from where the prisoners had lived. They went back to Majdanek for 6 weeks. And from there, they then were taken after a 4-day march in June of 1944 to Auschwitz-Birkenau. And this is the iconic picture of the tracks leading to the camp. In Auschwitz, you were processed, as in all the camps. And in Auschwitz is one of the camps, or the camp, where you had a tattoo placed on typically your left forearm. And this is my grandmother's tattoo that was placed on her arm. My mother's number is 1 right before, so I assume my mother was tattooed right before she was. Here's a photo of what the barracks looked like. You can see how crowded it was. Each of these slots are made for one person in the bunk beds, but you can see multiple people in there. My mother, as a teenager, she would always try to sleep on the top bunk because you weren't allowed to get out of bed. And if you had to go to the bathroom or if you had diarrhea, it would just drip through the wooden slats. The food was terrible. My mother said they were given 2 meals a day, this watery soup that had some rotten vegetables in it. And if you were lucky, some horse meat. And you got a little bit, a slice of stale bread, a little bit of margarine, and a drink they called coffee that was thickened with sawdust. And it's not enough to live on, but this is what these people had to do. And all of these people were chosen to work. Going on to the last 3 camps that my mother and grandmother and Vivian were at, Bergen-Belsen, Ascherleben, and Theresienstadt. So they were taken to Bergen-Belsen in the fall of 1944. And the conditions at Bergen-Belsen, I remember my mother telling me, were very, very poor. And they didn't work them. It was sometimes good to go out and work because they had something to do. But it sounded like they just stayed in the bunks. They didn't do any works. Many people got sick. Many people got typhus. That was a common disease. That's a louse-borne disease. And my mother, I remember her telling me, she just used to pick the lice off her body all the time. While they were at Bergen-Belsen, my mother figured out, she did not know them, but Anne Frank and her sister Margot were at Bergen-Belsen, where they eventually died when my mother and grandmother and Vivian were there. They were in, here's another photograph of the women's barracks in Bergen-Belsen. And here's after liberation, some men standing around at Bergen-Belsen. But they were here for several months. I remember my mother telling me when I was a kid that she worked on building aircrafts, that she worked on airplanes. And I couldn't imagine my mother ever building aircrafts during the war. And in my research, just for planning this talk, I came across on the U.S. Holocaust survivors website, on the museum's website, on Holocaust survivors database, an article that had a list of 500 women from Bergen-Belsen to the Junkers Ascherleben camp. And it says here that it was January 23rd, 1945. And I knew from talking to Vivian, because Vivian was one of the last in the group to survive, and she had the identical story to my mother and grandmother, that I knew that they had left in January of 45, Bergen-Belsen, to go to this factory. So I go through the list, and sure enough, there's my mother's name and my grandmother's name on the list, going to this aircraft factory where they worked on the aircraft engines. The Junker was a big factory in Germany, and they used concentration camp prisoners from July of 44 to almost the end of the war to work on these aircrafts. And that's what my mother did. Ascherleben was a subcamp of Vilkaviskis. And just in my research, I found some of these documents. This is my mother. I need to get this translated. I'm sorry I didn't do it before the talk. But I don't know if it's a checklist of belongings, but that's my mother. Here's some more information from that camp. And it has the date that they arrived. And the same thing for my grandmother from concentration. KL stands for concentration camp in German, Buchenwald. From there, they went to Theresienstadt. They went on a 1-week march and then a train trip and finally came, and they were greeted, as everybody at many of the camps, with the sign Arbeit macht frei, work makes you free. But work never made you free in these camps. They were finally liberated in April of 1945. These are some of the documents from Theresienstadt that I was able to find from processing. The Nazis kept everything. They had meticulous records, and you could go and look up this stuff online. It's there. So the war's over, they're free. So where do you go? Everybody wanted to go back home, but you couldn't go back home. Their homes were not there. Their homes were being occupied by others. There was still a lot of anti-Semitism, a lot of hatred of the Jews in the world. So a lot of people ended up in displaced persons camps. The Allies put together, you can see on this map, a number of camps. They were mainly in Germany and Austria. My mother was in this camp here in Bad Gastein. I'm going to talk about it in just a moment, but I just wanted you to see where it is in Austria, right near Italy. And I want you to remember this town here, Linz, Austria, because we're going to be talking about that in a little bit, where another displaced persons camp was. But my mother and grandmother and Vivian were in Bad Gastein. These are some identity papers in the camps, in the displaced persons camps that they had. And I thought it was ironic, I had just found this not long ago, that their tattooed number is listed on here. You know, the Nazis tattooed everybody to dehumanize them because you no longer had a name. You were just a number. But they were still identifying these displaced persons camps if they had a tattoo with their number. And this is my grandmother's card here, her ID card. Here's a photograph of Badgastan. Where they lived, it was actually a hotel. Different camps used different facilities. Some even used old concentration camps and turned them into displaced persons camps. But this is Badgastan, where my mother and grandmother were. My mother even had her photograph taken in a uniform. I don't think this is her uniform, but she wanted she was a teenager and she wanted a picture to remind herself what she looked like in a uniform. It looks like a glamour shot, but this is her, and my grandmother did the same thing and had herself photograph taken in someone's uniform there. These are some of their friends. This is my mother at the bottom left and my grandmother at the bottom right, and this is Vivian next to my grandmother. And in this photograph, my mother at the top right and Vivian at the top center, and my grandmother right there. And the people at the bottom, Sarah Sheeler and her sons, Paul and Martin. Sarah became my grandmother's best friend when she moved to New York. They were both good friends and such a lovely family. Martin and Paul survived Buchenwald at a very young age as young kids. And Martin should be with us on the program tonight, so I hope he's able to watch. He was planning to. He's living in Florida today. But I loved Miss Sheeler for another reason, because she owned Barton's chocolate store in Brooklyn. So I used to love to get the chocolates from her. And what do they do in a displaced persons camp? They learned an occupation. You have to remember these people lost their education. You know, if you go back to when Poland was invaded by the Nazis in 1933, and now it's 1945, these people lost their education. So one of the things my mother, this is my mother right here in the kind of, I don't know if that's flowered or patterned dress, she's learning to sew, and she's learning to sew by an organization that still exists today that many of you may even support, or to the Organization for Rehabilitation, through training, which still trains people around the world today. And now we move on to Vilkaviskis, Lithuania. So remember where you left my mother and grandmother off. They were in the DP camp in Badgastan, Austria. And now we're going to tell the story of my father. And we go now to Vilkaviskis, Lithuania. Vilkaviskis, Lithuania was a town of about 10,000 people. So not many people lived in Vilkaviskis, but like Grodno, where my mother was from, 40% of the population was Jewish. It had a very large Jewish population, 4,000 people. It was located 15 miles from the East German border. And my father was born April 14th, 1922. He lived in Vilkaviskis with his parents, his father, Mordechai, and mother, Zlata. And he had two older brothers. One was Joseph. That's his name, Americanized name, but I'm going to call him Joseph. And Joseph was married to Rika. Rika was a refugee from Poland. A lot of people thought it might be safer in Lithuania, so her family sent her from Poland to Lithuania. Joseph was in the Lithuanian army. He was a sharpshooter even. They had another brother, Raphael, and a little sister, Rivka. The Penns had a store that catered to the Christian farmers. It was like a grocery farmer supply store. So if you needed something from your farm, you would go to the Penn store and you could buy it. And the town of Vilkaviskis had many, many synagogues. They had old age homes, 2 Jewish libraries, a Jewish elementary school, a Jewish high school. Most of the businesses were owned by Jews. This is just a photograph of the town square. And as you saw the synagogue, the Jews had lived there a long time. That synagogue was from the 1500s. So Jews had been around this town for a long time. Here's another scene of Vilkaviskis in the well where they would get water to drink. And one more photograph of just life in Vilkaviskis and the bridge leading into town. Big industry in Vilkaviskis was making brushes out of boar bristle brushes, but that was one of the bigger industries in this village. Before the Nazis came in, the Russians came in, and it was 1940 when the Russians took over Vilkaviskis, June of 1940. And a year later, June of 1941, the Nazis came in. They created ghettos. My father had to help build the ghetto that was string up the barbed wire around it. And one day, it was July 28th, 1941 at 6 a.m., the SS came in with collaborators from the area and made all the men come out of the ghetto. They met, I think, in the town square, and they were being selected to be taken to the outskirts of town. Some of them were chosen for a work detail, which was my father and Uncle Joseph. And they were taken to an area outside of town where my father and uncle went into this barrack, and their job was to sort the belongings because, like any trip, when you're leaving your home, you were told to gather up some of your personal belongings. And their job was to sort through all the belongings of these men, of all the Jewish men from Vilkaviskis that had been rounded up. The rest of the men were told to go behind this barrack and start digging a big pit. They didn't know what this pit was going to be for, but they probably dug all day and all night. And the next day, my father heard commotion coming from the area where the pit was being built. And before, he didn't think much of it, but he was going through the belongings of the men because that's what Joseph and his job were. And he found his father's jacket. And inside, it may have been a secret compartment that was sewn in there, but he found this photograph of his parents. It's a passport size, so it's kind of large here that you're seeing, but it's really about the size of a passport, and you'll see it again later to get an idea of the size. But this photograph of my father's and Joseph's parents would end up being the only possession that they have of their family from before the war. So they heard the commotion after they found the photograph, and they looked out the window of this barrack, and they saw the Jewish men, including their father and brother, lined up in front of the pits. My father said they were lined up 5 in a row. And then he watched as they started shooting bullets into the men. My father said they tried to use one bullet to go through all 5, and they just fell into the pits. And when they saw this, they realized it was not safe in Vilkaviskis anymore. And my father and uncle went back to their mother and little sister and said, "We've got to go into hiding. We can't live here." And they contacted some of the Christian farmers that they had done business with in their store and asked them, "Will you hide us?" And some of these Christian farmers said yes. They hid my father on one farm. They hid his brother and his wife, my aunt and uncle, Rick and Joseph, on another farm. And they hid my father's mother and little sister on still another farm. And they moved them around from farm to farm because they didn't want anybody to get suspicious. But unfortunately, their mother and little sister were betrayed and they were murdered. They were finally liberated by the Russians. It was October 16th, 1944, and they were finally free. And my father was sent to a displaced persons camp in Linz, Austria, called Bindermechel. And here's some of his paperwork. He was head of the police force in this displaced persons camp. Another person you may know who ended up in this camp is probably a young teenager, was Wolf Finkelman, who became a lifelong friend of my father's in Houston. But this is the camp that they were in. Here's a photograph of my father. He's right under, this is Theodore Herzl, who's the father of Israel, and that's my father right under his beard. It looks like a U.S. Military person, but I don't know what the event was. But this was in Bendermechel. Now, I had said to remember Linz on the map. It was kind of close to Bagastan, because the next door neighbor of my mother and grandmother were my father's brother and sister-in-law. So he would go from Linz, Austria, to Bagastan to visit his brother and sister-in-law. And he then met Linda and Riva, my mother and grandmother. This is a picture of my aunt and uncle, Rachel and Joseph. I think Meyer Joseph was his real name, but Rick and Joseph Penn after the war. In the DP camp, their daughter Zahava, Sandra, was born. She should be with us today watching this program. And this is a photograph of them in the camp. Then finally, my father, he was trying to get somewhere, and he was finally able to leave. He knew he had relatives in South Africa, a wonderful family there, and he wrote them, and they said they would be delighted to sponsor him. You had to have a sponsor wherever you were going to go as a refugee. But they told him it was a 10-year wait to get into South Africa. But did you know you have relatives in Houston, Texas? And he read the letter and he thought, where is Houston, Texas? He had never heard of it. But he wrote the Payne family. Jenny Payne was the matriarch of the family. And I think we might have several of the Payne family members with us today. They're still here in Houston. Jerry Payne, Stephen Payne, Lynn Payne Shapiro, hopefully are watching. And my father was able to get paperwork and make it there. Here's the manifest, the list of the names, and there he is, Isaac Penn. That's why the I in his name is so important in Morris I. Penn, because his real name was Isaac. And it said he was a bookkeeper from Lithuania. But he was making it as a Lithuanian Jew, born on April 14th, 1922. He left for the USA. He left from Brennen, Germany, and he was put on a train in Boston, given a $5 bill by a Jewish organization, and then came on the train here to Houston, Texas. This photograph, if anybody knows me, this is my favorite photograph at Holocaust Museum Houston. It's a larger than life photo, and it shows my father here just as he got off the train coming to America. I could spend an hour talking about the photograph because it was actually being taken of Leon Box by his brother Jason with their wives and children at the time. And my father happened to be in the photograph. And they gave him a copy of it because they recognized him years later or at some point later. But it shows my father getting off the train. He's wearing a suit that was made from scraps of material by a tailor at the displaced persons camp that he had been in. He's 27 years old in this photograph, and he doesn't speak a word of English. And when I give tours at Holocaust Museum, and all of you are welcome to come on one of my tours or my wife's tour, she's also a docent, I talk about this photograph. And I ask the visitors, what country it was taken. Most people say Germany. And when somebody finally says United States, the number one answer is New York City. But someone usually will say it was taken in Houston, Texas. And then I ask, what is the site where this photograph was taken today? And sometimes I don't get the answer, but often someone will say Minute Maid Park, because when the Astros hit a home run, the Houston Astros, for those of you not watching from Houston, our baseball team, if they hit a home run or win the game, a train goes by at the stadium, a full sized locomotive, to remember that that's where the train station was. So this is at this train station. It shows my father. But the next question I ask our visitors, I say, what is the expression on his face? And they all say he's smiling. He's happy to be here in the United States. And we were so thankful to the Penn family for sponsoring him, because you couldn't just come to this country. You had to be sponsored, somebody to make sure they had a place for you to live and get you English lessons and feed you and help you find a job. But one of my father's first jobs was with Mandel Khan, and some of you in Houston may know the Mandel family. Mo Mandel, his son Joel, and his children Cindy, Barry, and Marlene. But soon after that, my father remembered meeting that woman in Europe. And a year after this photograph was taken, his brother, sister-in-law, and niece, Sandra, arrived in Houston, thanks to the Penn family again, and they were all reunited in 1950. But also in 1950, my mother and grandmother immigrated to this country. And my father remembers meeting her. This is my mother's documents. That was a photograph of the ship. I don't think she came when there were icebergs in the ocean, but that's the Greenlee that she came on. And let me just show you their names, Kremer, Riva, and Luba. They went to Worcester, Massachusetts, where they had relatives, and soon went on to New York City, where all their friends were. And this is a photograph of my mother and grandmother after arriving in America in 1950. But my aunt kept pestering my father, you should go look up Luba. I heard she's in New York City. And so he contacted her somehow, and he went up to visit her in New York City. After being in Houston for a little while, he knew how warm it was, and he went to New York City in the winter without a jacket, but fortunately he was able to buy one there, but had a wonderful time with Luba. And soon after, she came to visit in Houston, and she came in August. So she must have been true love if she could survive Houston in August. But this is my father, my mother, my Aunt Rika, and Uncle Joseph with their daughter, Sandra. And there were definitely lovebirds in the air. And the invitation soon came out that they were to be married. My sister had just found this invitation, and you see they got married in Brooklyn, New York. They all had their Americanized names now, Riva, Joseph, Morris. My mother was still called Luba. But I put this in there because I thought it was so touching that normally the parents give their children away to be married, to get married. And there's my grandmother's name, Riva Kremer. But my aunt and uncle's name was listed on the wedding invitation because he had no parents to give him away. And then this is the photograph that you have already seen, the day of their wedding, December 22nd, 1951. And they moved back immediately back to Houston, where they started their life. I was born 2.5 years after their wedding day, my brother 3 years after me. And then my father had an opportunity to start his own business. And we moved to this town, New Gulf, Texas. Probably most of you have not heard of New Gulf. But New Gulf is about 60 miles from Houston. It's near about 14 miles from Wharton, Texas, which some of you may have heard of in Wharton County. And it was the sulfur capital of the world. New Gulf produced more sulfur, the mine there, than any other sulfur mine in the world. Everything was yellow in New Gulf. But this is a view of the town of about 1,500 people, and the smokestacks to the right. And this is a view of Main Street. There were probably about 12 businesses down. And ours, I think it must have been right here. I'll need to find a photograph of the store, New Gulf department store. We lived in the back of the store, but this was my parents' first break in 1957, less than 10 years after coming to this country. But I mentioned New Gulf because when we came there, people were so warm. They were so genuinely kind to my family, and we just have never forgotten that. My parents worked side by side in another store that they established in League City until about 1986 when they retired. Cynthia was born in New Gulf, by the way, and we moved back to Houston as the completed family in 1965. And I'm obviously skipping a lot, but they did work side by side together. And when they retired, they started their next profession, and that was educating people about the Holocaust. They went to schools, churches, whoever would listen to them. But then my father got this idea. He really wanted to go back to Vilkaviskis to find these Christian farmers that had hit him, or at least their families. And it was 1992, 30 years ago, about right now. And the Soviet Union had already broken up, and Lithuania was its own country. And we took off to Poland, Lithuania. This is a photograph on my left of my wife and I, and then on the right with myself with my father and mother at the airport. And we eventually get to Vilkaviskis. We first went to some of the concentration camps my mother was in Poland, and then went to Grodno, her hometown, and we ended up in Vilkaviskis. It still had about 10,000 inhabitants. We met with one of my father's the daughter of one of his rescuers. You know, this woman, they're about the same age, so they really didn't do the rescuing, but it was their parents. And this is all of us, my sister-in-law, Pam, brother Robert, my wife, Lynn, my mother, and myself with this daughter of a rescuer. This is another son of a rescuer, Algius, that we got to meet. My father used to tutor him in the barn when he couldn't go out, when he was being hidden. And he had to leave their home because August got very good at math from my father's tutoring, and his teacher got very suspicious what was going on and had to move on to another farm. But we met in the home of Petrus and Ursula Maladukas. They were still living in the same home that they had hid Jews in during the war. This is Petrus right here, this older man. This is his wife on the right, and this is their daughter in this black and white pattern outfit. She was 3 years old at the time when they were hiding Jews in their home, and she was now the high school principal in Vilkaviskis, who spoke beautiful English, although my father had worked very hard on his Lithuanian. She helped translate everything. But we asked Petrus, why did you do this? Why did you risk your life, the life of your wife, and the life of your then 3-year-old daughter to save Jews that you didn't even know? And tears just started flowing from his eyes. And he said it had to be done. It had to be done. They brought their children and grandchildren of the rescuers. And we went to the site where my father had watched his father and brother be murdered and be buried, as well as other Jews of Vilkaviskis. And there's a memorial, as you can see, at that site. But they all brought tulips, and we put tulips around that center zone of soil as a memory to them. And my father and all of us said Kaddish for the same time at their gravesite. This is a photograph of my parents later in life. And here's a photograph of my grandmother, father, and mother. My grandmother moved in with us in 1965 when we moved back to Houston from New Gulf, and she took care of us while our parents worked. And my mother was never ashamed of showing her tattoo. This is a photograph of her displaying it. And I have friends that go back to childhood that remember her telling them about her tattoo. My grandmother, on the other hand, it was very hard for her to tell her story. She was older. She lost her husband. She lost her son, countless relatives. And it was very difficult whenever I would ask her questions because I was trying to make a family tree. I remember once, and she would just break out crying. You would hear her screaming at night from her room in our house. So I couldn't ask her. But when she turned 99 years old, Holocaust Museum Houston really felt that they should honor her. It was August 12, 2005. The Houston Chronicle put on a beautiful spread, as you can see here, about her life. And it was a beautiful birthday party because they didn't know if she was going to be around any longer. And they just wanted to celebrate her life at her 99th birthday. But she fooled them. They had to come back and have another birthday party for her to celebrate her 100th birthday a year later. Unfortunately, she died just shy of her 101st birthday. But this is the legacy of my parents. This is one of the last photographs of my father with everyone at my sister right here's daughter, Melanie, bat mitzvah, and that's their other daughter, Lauren, my brother and sister-in-law, Robert and Pam, with their children, Jordan and Jamie, and my wife, Lynn, and myself with my father. And this is their legacy. And Rick and Joseph also had a legacy. They had 2 children with 5 grandchildren and five great-grandchildren. Rick and Joseph were married over 72 years, and they lived the rest of their life here in Houston. My father carried that photograph of his parents with him all the time. If you would have gone up to him and started a conversation, he would pull out his wallet and show you this photograph. And this is the only thing we have left from his entire family from before the war. It's now in the archives at the museum, and a copy of it is on display in the Holocaust Gallery at Holocaust Museum Houston in the section under Hidden Children. And it was my turn to start learning about the Holocaust. My wife was already a docent, and I decided it's time for me to step up. So this is my graduation class when I became a docent at Holocaust Museum Houston on November 8th, 2009. That's me over to the far right. And some of us are still docenting. But my father was so proud of all of us, all the docents that day, that we're carrying this story of all the Houston survivors, and he was sharing stories that day. But he was really proud that he could take a deep breath knowing that I was going to continue telling his story, because 2 days after this photograph was taken, he died. And we end with a series of photographs of children saying, "We remember." And you can see in this photograph, you can see, let me get this all figured out here. Can you see them? You can see there's children here remembering. You can tell it's a cold day, that it's winter with the snow on the ground. They have their signs, but you can also kind of guess the year because they're all wearing masks. So this was January 21st, January 27th, 2021, just a year ago, just a little over a year ago, on International Holocaust Remembrance Day. And there's also a memorial here. You can see this big obelisk type in the ground, and there's candles around it because they're remembering. They're remembering at the site where my father watched his brother and father be murdered. This is at that site where they're buried. So these students are remembering. They're remembering what happened to the murdered Jews of Vilkaviskis. They're remembering the Holocaust. And you wonder, will they keep remembering? This was a year and a half ago, but I can tell you that they remembered this year. and a group of them, although not as much snow on the ground and not as many masks on outside, they were remembering those who passed away, not only at the site, but also in the classroom. These students at Vilkaviskis are remembering those who passed away. And they're also, we hope, are learning the lessons that we teach at Holocaust Museum Houston, that we must be kind to each other and we must treat each other with dignity and with respect. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Hi. That was such a really important story that you just retold. And I can see that we've got a bunch of questions here for you. So
Sure.
Get ready to answer them.
Okay.
Okay, let's see. So here's an interesting question. How and when did you learn about your parents and grandmother being Holocaust survivors? And what questions sort of prompted a conversation about this?
Yeah, it's a good question. You know, different children of survivors have different experiences. And my parents never really hid anything. My mother had her tattoo and she was not ashamed of showing it. So I grew up with a mother with a tattoo. In today's world, having your mother with a tattoo is probably not that unusual, but it was then. And, you know, she would tell me a little bit, I would find things out. And just with time, I think it got more and more, as I got older, I learned more and they revealed more to me. You know, early on, Holocaust survivors weren't talking about it. They were trying to move on with their life and nobody wanted to listen to what they had to say. And in the mid 80s, they started realizing if we don't tell our stories, nobody is. And they started talking more. It was in high school that I first interviewed my mother for a class at Congregation Beth Yeshurun that I had in Hillel High School, where I had to do an interview for my teacher. And then I presented it for my youth group. And so I started asking questions and learned more and more. But that, I guess, is my earliest recollection.
You mentioned in your story that you had, you know, your father had family in South Africa. And a question is, do you still have family in South Africa?
Yes, we do. And as a matter of fact, Brenda Fine immigrated to Israel. And I told her not to stay up till 3 o'clock in the morning to watch. So I hope she's not watching, but she sometimes stays up. So she may be watching, but she's relatives with the Payne family too. So she's one of the matriarchs of that family now. And her family was the one that sent my father to check out Houston.
And this is a question about the rescuers of your father. Were the rescuers' children and grandchildren aware of what they had done?
Yeah, I think they kind of knew. And it was interesting there. I don't know if some of the pictures I saw some young children there, because these were the children mainly of the rescuers, but they brought their children too, because they wanted them to know what their grandparents had risked. You know, they could have been shot on the spot for hiding Jews. And it was very important for them to educate their children, their young children, about what had happened.
There was another question here. Somebody said that you need to do the program in Austin.
Sure.
And so I have a question about your, you know, the going to Vilkaviskis. Can you tell us about your presentation to the students?
Oh, you're talking about my, yes. I did the same a version of this presentation just a few months ago. I thought, wouldn't it be neat, now with Zoom, you can go anywhere, to give it to school children in Vilkaviskis, Lithuania. And right before the pandemic, Holocaust Museum Houston had a trip to Lithuania and Poland that my wife and I were all registered to go on. I think it was leaving in April and the pandemic started in March. So that got canceled, but I started getting contacts of people, and I got in touch with a woman who is from Vilkaviskis, Irma, and she's an expert on the Jewish history of there. And I told her, if you have any friends who are teachers that would like a presentation of my father's story, I'd be happy to do that. So we had to get up started at 6 in the morning because their last class was at 2 p.m. But I got up with Nicole from the museum, and we started the Zoom program. And they were so interested in what we had to say. And their teacher even posted the event on Facebook and just wrote a beautiful post about it.
Yeah, Zoom enabled us to do a lot of things we could never think we could do.
Absolutely.
How did the Jewish community in Houston receive your parents and grandmother? Were they welcomed nicely?
Oh, absolutely. I don't know if a lot of people know, but Houston was a very welcoming community for Holocaust survivors. Almost 1,000 survivors made Houston their home. And, they had families who were your sponsors take you in, but some of our survivors came, as children even, and were able to start a life and move on in the world. But Houston was a very, very welcoming community for the survivors, with all the support systems they had in place, including, I'm sure, the Jewish Family Service.
So, when your father was in Lithuania, a question is, did he encounter any Lithuanians who were perpetrators or just Nazis that he encountered?
Yeah, I mean, there, a lot of, unfortunately, a lot of people were collaborators from the community, and the Lithuanian police were, my father said, were involved in the shootings. And that's what the Holocaust, anybody who reads about the Holocaust by bullets will know that it wasn't only the Nazis, but they got other people in the communities to jump on the bandwagons and killed many, many people, especially in the Ukraine. Many, many people died just with the help of collaborators.
You said that your father was liberated by the Russians on October the 16th, 1944. Did the Russians build the DP camp where he went?
I think my father's camp was run by the U.S., but I don't know. The Russians, I think, did have camps, but I don't quote me on that. But he wasn't in a Russian camp, and I don't know the story. I may have to talk to my cousin. She may know the story because she was alive then, of where they went. I know they were trying, actually. My mother and grandmother, along with Joseph, Rick, and Sandra, I guess too, were trying to get to Israel, and they couldn't get there. They were able to sneak across the Alps into Italy, and they didn't get anywhere there, and they ended up in another displaced persons camp in Cremona, Italy.
Where did your mother and grandmother get the clothes they wore in Treblinka?
I have a feeling, they got to that camp, and it was interesting. I worked on this presentation. I had a presentation for a while, but I really got into it, and you have to be careful because it's addicting. But you start getting testimonies, and I found a testimony from another woman, I think is from California, and you could piece the whole, it was like a puzzle piecing everything together. But when they came to this camp, it had been desolated, and they came into the barracks, and there was stuff everywhere. So it may have been some of these people had just arrived, but there was clothing there. So I think a lot of the stuff was just lying around, but they were able to eat pretty well while they were there. I think that's one of the reasons why my mother and grandmother were able to survive. They had times that were terrible, and then they would be sent, like when they went to that aircraft factory, they were given good food, and they were given a hot shower every night, allowed to have a hot shower. And what that does for morale and just having sustenance.
For sure.
To go on because they wanted workers.
All right, so we'll have one last question. And that was, how was it possible for your family to keep the documents, or were they obtained elsewhere?
I had none of these documents in my possession. I found them online. The everything after the war, like the displaced persons camp documents, those my parents have, as we have their naturalization, certificate from the United States, that they had with them because it was after the war. But all those other documents, you could go online right now and find my parents, those same documents. I just put their names in. It's now, I think it's the, I'm blanking on the name of the Bar Arsalan, the Bar Arsalan depository where a lot of documents are. And I think it's now connected with the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. And one thing I forgot to mention, that my grandmother did have a sister that survived, and she eventually made it up to Israel. And I'm hoping their grandchildren are watching. One's in Israel and one's in Toronto tonight too.
So we also have somebody who asked an interesting question here about, her name's Ruthie Danziger, and she has asked if she can donate some documents that she found of her father to the museum. And my answer is yes, please call the museum. Carol Manley is our collections manager, director, and she'll be able to assist. And if not, you can call me and I'll direct you in the right direction. And
I just saw that Martin Sheeler's name popped up.
Yes.
The picture that I showed of he and his family that survived Buchenwald, that met my mother and grandmother in the DP camp.
Well, hi. Thank you so much for sharing your story. We, can't express enough how important it is to keep these memories alive for future generations. So you're doing a mitzvah for your late parents. And I want to be considerate of everyone's time. It's 7:10. We've run a little bit over, but hi, it was so interesting listening to you and answering all the questions. So thank you, everyone, for joining us this evening, and good night.
Thank you.